The last thing my father said to me before he placed my hand in my husband's was that he wished I had never been born. He said it smiling. That matters. Not because cruelty hurts less when it arrives cleanly dressed. Because men like my father believe composure changes the moral temperature of the blade. We were standing just inside the chapel doors. The music had already started. The guests were turning Geta. My veil was pinned so tightly at the back of my head that my scalp ached, and the bouquet in my hand smelled like garden roses. Eucalyptus. And the kind of money people spend when they want beauty to behave, like proof. My father leaned slightly toward me, still smiling for the photographer, and whispered, "If your mother had listened to me 28 years ago, neither of us would have had to live through you." Then he straightened, lifted his chin, and walked me forward, as if he had not just split the day open. "My name is Claire Holloway." The man whose arm I was holding as the church doors opened. The man wearing polished black shoes, a silver tie, and the face he used for public decency, was my father, Edward Holloway. The woman waiting in the first pew with pearl earrings, a pressed smile, and 25 years of loyal revisionism behind her was my mother, Judith. And by the time the reception ended that night, the room that had spent my entire life helping them call our family respectable had finally heard what respect actually costs when a daughter is the one paying for it. If this story reaches into something real in you, subscribe now. Some parents do not destroy you loudly. They do it with precision, timing, and a lifelong commitment to making sure your pain always looks badly managed compared to their image. I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, in a brick colonial with dark shutters, white hydrangeas, and the kind of front hall my mother waxed hard enough to make visitors think discipline was a form of love. From the street, we looked stable. My father was a commercial real estate attorney with careful suits, careful opinions, and a voice that people described as reassuring because they had never been the target of his disappointment. My mother chaired museum lunches, corrected grammar in Christmas cards, and believed deeply that embarrassment was not an emotion but a management failure. Then there was me, only child, no sibling to compare me to, no brother to inherit the visible preference, no sister to split the female roles between. That sounds easier to outsiders. It wasn't. When a family has only one daughter, all the pressure has to go somewhere. In mine, it went into design. Not clothing design. Life design. My father wanted a child who would move through the world cleanly enough to reflect well on him. Confident, but not inconvenient. Accomplished, but not confrontational. Grateful, but not observant. My mother wanted a daughter who made rooms easier. A girl who understood that women exist partly to absorb male weather and still pass hors d'oeuvres without shaking. I was not that girl. Not because I was wild. Not because I was cruel. Because I noticed things. I noticed tone. I noticed timing. I noticed that my father's kindness toward other people came from a budget that somehow ran dry when the person in front of him shared his last name and wanted emotional clarity instead of tuition checks. He was generous in all the ways a man can be generous, while still remaining fundamentally ungiving. He paid for piano lessons, summer camps, sat prep. My mother liked to list these things later whenever I suggested my childhood had not been easy. As if expense erased atmosphere. As if good schools could neutralize the sound of your father inhaling once before saying the sentence that would ruin your week. My earliest clear memory of him is from the kitchen when I was 6. I was coloring at the table. He came in late from work. Dark coat, rain on the shoulders, briefcase in one hand. My mother asked whether he would make it to the school recital on Thursday. He took off his watch, set it on the counter, and said, "If Claire remembers not to look terrified this time." I remember freezing over the blue crayon. Not because the sentence was explosive, because it was the first time I felt how adults can turn performance anxiety into character failure if they need a child to harden on schedule. At the recital, I played correctly, hands trembling. He clapped once at the end. In the car home, he said, "See, you're far less embarrassing when you control yourself." That was my father's version of encouragement. He did not build you. He carved away whatever he thought weakened the silhouette. My mother rarely contradicted him directly. That would be too simple, too honest. Instead, she translated. If he called me dramatic, she would later sit on the edge of my bed and say, "You know how much your father values strength?" If he mocked my sensitivity, she would smooth my hair and say, "He just wants life to be easier for you than it was for women in my generation." Her gift was laundering cruelty through concern. That is a dangerous kind of mothering, because it leaves the child unsure whether she is being protected or professionally managed. By the time I was 10, I had become good at two things: anticipating mood and disappearing cleanly. I could tell from the front door close whether my father had lost a deal, disliked a lunch, or been forced to endure someone more powerful than himself in a conference room. I could tell from the way my mother arranged the silverware whether she intended dinner to remain domestic or perform aspirational harmony in case my father needed reminding of what. Exactly. He worked to preserve. And I learned quickly that my safest position in the system was useful, polished, and emotionally inexpensive. That became my assigned shape. Not rebellious daughter. Not golden child. Presentation daughter. I was good at school because good grades reduced household friction. I learned social grace because social grace made my mother visibly relax. I joined debate in high school, ironically, because it was the first place adults praised me for saying what I meant without immediately asking me to soften it for male comfort. My father hated debate at first. Too adversarial, too public, too likely to make me one of those women. But when I started winning, he changed his mind. Not because he respected my voice, because success with institutional approval is the only kind of female boldness men like him can tolerate without feeling directly corrected. At 16, I won a statewide speaking competition. I still remember the ballroom. Cheap chandeliers, blue carpet, coffee breath in the judges' row. When they called my name, my father shook my hand afterward, like I had closed a deal for the family. In the car, he said, "You're far more compelling when you speak prepared rather than emotional." That line did two jobs at once. Praise on top, punishment underneath. My mother turned in her seat and smiled. "Your father means you're excellent when you're disciplined." No. He meant I was easiest to admire when I made him forget I had a private interior life. In college, I studied communications and nonprofit leadership at Georgetown. My father wanted law. My mother wanted something graceful and useful. I wanted work that involved people, systems, and public truth. without requiring me to become another beautifully upholstered liar in a conference room. Nonprofit strategy surprised them. Not enough to object cleanly. Enough to disapprove with polish. My father called it morally decorative. That phrase still makes me laugh in the wrong way. Because men who bill by the hour for corporate land disputes are often the quickest to call visible compassion performative. I left anyway. Distance helped. It always does. Some daughters think they are unstable, until geography reveals they were simply overexposed to one man's contempt. At Georgetown, I became legible to myself in ways I had not been at home. Friends liked me for reasons unrelated to family polish. Professors trusted me with work that required judgment, not just neatness. I interned with a women's housing nonprofit and discovered that I was very good in rooms where other people were unraveling. Not because I was detached, because I had spent years learning how to stay functional, while emotional weather moved through the walls. That skill, extracted from one context, became competence in another. My father called my job choices low-return idealism. My mother called them admirably sincere. That is the thing about daughters who do not follow the script. Their actual achievements get endlessly translated into tonal adjectives, so the family never has to update the hierarchy. At 24, I met Noah. Yes, I'm naming him. Noah Fletcher. Architect. Baltimore-based at the time. Broad shoulders. Patient eyes. The kind of man who let silence exist long enough for truth to come out of it naturally. We met at a fundraising dinner where the venue lighting was terrible. The keynote speaker was late, and I was trying to rescue a seating disaster involving 3 donors. One city councilwoman, and a board vice chair who believed allergy accommodations were a personal insult. Noah was there because his firm had donated pro bono design services for one of our shelter renovation projects. He watched me solve the room. That was his phrase later. Watching you solve the room was the first attractive thing. I laughed when he said it. Then fell in love with him slowly enough that it felt like building, not luck. He listened. He noticed where I went quiet and didn't rush to fill it. He never mistook my composure for lack of feeling. That was new. Dangerously new. The first time I brought him home for Christmas, my mother approved instantly. Architect sounded elegant enough. His family had old Maryland money, but didn't perform it so aggressively that my father had to feel either inferior or triumphant. Noah dressed well. Spoke cleanly. Knew how to carry a wine glass, and let older people interrupt him without trying to win the room back. In other words, he was socially expensive in exactly the way my parents understood. That should have made things easier. It didn't. Because men like my father do not only assess whether a future husband is adequate, they assess whether their daughter, by being loved well, may begin speaking with a confidence no longer routed through paternal permission. The engagement happened on a rainy October weekend in Beaufort. Not flashy. A dock. Gray water. Wind off the marsh. He asked with cold hands and a voice steadier than mine. I said yes, before he finished the sentence. When I called my parents, my mother cried beautifully. My father said, "Well, he seems sensible." Sensible. That was how he greeted the largest joy of my adult life. Not congratulations. Not I'm happy for you. Sensible. My mother hosted an engagement dinner 3 weeks later. Cream flowers. Polished silver. Her wedding china. My father gave a toast about tradition. Family continuity. and the privilege of seeing one's child make a wise match. Wise match. I remember staring into my water glass and thinking how fascinating it was that even in celebration, some fathers still speak as though the central miracle is not that their daughter is loved, but that she has finally validated their standards. Wedding planning brought out the worst in all of us. That is not unusual. Weddings are X-rays. They show which families confuse love with control, hospitality with hierarchy, money with narrative ownership. My mother wanted church, historical hotel reception, calligraphy, string quartet, white peonies. If the season could be manipulated hard enough. My father wanted guest list influence, old clients present, seating that reflected professional hierarchy, and the sort of reception speech where he could appear gracious without ever having to acknowledge the actual history of our relationship. I wanted something simpler. Noah wanted me sane. We compromised the way adults compromise when one side is paying more and the other side has a stronger relationship to emotional consequences. My parents offered substantial financial support. That mattered. It always matters. Not because money controls truth completely, because it complicates freedom. Girls raised like me know how expensive it feels to reject help, even when the help arrives attached to invisible script notes. Every time I objected to something, my mother would say, "We're doing this for you?" Every time I pushed back on a guest list addition, my father would remind me which checks had already cleared. People think dependence means helplessness. It doesn't. Often it means you are allowed choices only inside a room someone else designed and paid to keep looking voluntary. The fights were never explosive. My family was too trained for that. They were elegant, lengthy, exhausting. My mother wanted me in her veil. I didn't. My father wanted me to invite a senior partner from his old firm, whose wife once told me at 15 that I would soften into beauty eventually if I stopped looking so watchful. I didn't. My mother said, "It would mean so much." My father said, "You don't understand how memory works in relationships." I wanted to say, "No, you don't understand how resentment does." But daughters like me learn to ration truth before major events. Because if we say everything every time, we get rewritten as unstable long before anyone else is called difficult. About 4 months before the wedding, the first real crack appeared. I was finalizing ceremony wording with the minister when he asked whether my father would be giving a blessing at the rehearsal dinner. I said I didn't know. Then, without really planning to, I heard myself ask, "Do fathers ever decline that?" The minister, to his credit, did not answer too fast. He was an older man with lined hands, patient eyes, and the sort of pastoral restraint that keeps rooms from becoming confessional theater too early. He said, "Sometimes fathers participate in weddings as a performance of family, more than as an extension of emotional intimacy." That sentence followed me home like weather. Performance of family. Yes, that was the phrase. My father loved all the visible stations of fatherhood. Tuition payment, handshake after accomplishment, public toast, walking the bride down the aisle. He simply resented the private obligations that make those public gestures honest. When I was 26, I made the mistake of telling him I wanted therapy. Not because I was in crisis. Because I had started understanding that my interior life felt like a room organized by someone else's voice. He looked at me across the dining table and said, "For what?" An expensive audience for ordinary self-absorption? My mother quickly added, "Your father worries modern people pathologize resilience." That became the family position. I was healthy enough to function. Therefore, anything hurting me must be indulgence. So I did what women in respectable families have done for generations. I found help privately. I paid for it myself. And I stopped seeking emotional permission from people whose self-image depended on misunderstanding me. By the time the wedding month arrived, I was tired in the deep, structural way. Brides become tired when what they are really managing is not flowers or timelines, but old family physics. Noah saw it. One evening, 2 weeks before the wedding, he stood in our kitchen while takeout noodles went cold on the counter and said, "You know you don't have to be handed over by anyone." That line undid me. Not because I hadn't thought it. Because hearing it aloud made the choice feel real. "I know." "Then why are you doing it?" I leaned against the counter and told the truth. Because if I change that now, my mother will make the entire wedding about grief. My father will make it about disrespect. And I don't want our marriage to begin with me, spending all my energy outrunning their reaction to a symbolic act. Noah nodded. He understood. That was one of his gifts. He knew the difference between surrender and strategic timing. "Still," he asked quietly, "and what does the symbolic act cost you?" That answer took longer. Finally, I said, "Probably exactly what it's always cost me. A version of myself going silent so the room stays manageable." He stepped closer, took my face in both hands, and said, "Then whatever happens that day, don't stay silent longer than you choose." That sentence became a hinge. Not dramatic in the moment. Foundational later. The wedding morning started beautifully enough to feel insulting. Late spring. Richmond bright with dogwoods and impossible sunlight. The suite smelled like hairspray, steam silk, orange blossom perfume, and coffee. None of us had time to drink properly. My bridesmaids moved around me in soft robes and half-finished makeup. My mother arrived in pale blue with the face she uses when she intends to be remembered as luminous by service staff. She kissed my cheek, told me I looked radiant, adjusted a pin without asking, then immediately asked whether I had approved the placement of the donor table cards for the reception. That was my mother. Even on the most intimate morning of my life, she remained partly loyal to logistics and optics, because true closeness makes women like her feel underdressed. My father appeared only once before the ceremony. Door half open. Suit immaculate. Boutonnière perfect. He looked at me in the mirror for a second and said, "You clean up well?" "Clean up well." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because some fathers spend a daughter's whole life rationing tenderness until even on her wedding day. The kindest sentence available still sounds like she was once a manageable mess that has finally justified the trouble. I said, "Thanks, Dad." He nodded. Then added, "Try not to cry through the vows. It photographs badly." And left. One of my bridesmaids, Talia, stared at the closed door and said, "Does he hear himself?" I adjusted my earring and said, "Only in rooms where he sounds reasonable." That may be the cleanest summary of my father I have ever given. By the time we arrived at the church, I had placed him where I always placed him emotionally, at a distance that allowed function without hope. That was the mistake. Hope is not the only thing that leaves you unprepared for harm. Sometimes low expectation does too. You tell yourself, I know who he is. I know how limited he is. I know what not to ask for. Then the person still finds a lower floor. The chapel was full. White flowers. Candlelight. Old wood. That cool church smell of polish. Dust. And prayer performed over decades. Through the side room wall, I could hear the first rise of strings as guests settled. My mother was already in front. The coordinator adjusted my train. Someone touched my shoulder. The photographer wanted one last hallway shot with my father. And there he was. At the side door, hand extended, face composed, the public father in full dress. For one absurd second, I looked at him and thought, maybe he'll behave. Not transform. Not suddenly become tender. Just behave. That was the final stupid prayer of my old life. He took my arm. The coordinator smiled. The doors prepared to open. And then, while the organ shifted and the whole room leaned toward us, he bent his head slightly and delivered the sentence that made everything else on either side of it feel like different centuries. If your mother had listened to me 28 years ago, neither of us would have had to live through you. I felt the blood leave my face. The bouquet stayed steady because years of training kept my hands from dropping. The smile in the photographer's frame remained almost intact because girls raised like me learn early that shock must be managed before adults can accuse us of spectacle. I did not look at him. That part matters. I knew if I turned my head, if I searched his face for any sign of regret, irone, instability, drunken cruelty, anything that might make the sentence less deliberate, I would find composure instead. And composure would be worse. So I looked straight ahead. The doors opened, and we walked. We reached the altar. That is the part people always ask me about later. How I kept walking. How I didn't stop. How I didn't pull my hand away. How I didn't turn to the guests and repeat what he had said while the organ was still playing and the illusion was young enough to die beautifully. The answer is not courage. It is conditioning. Children raised inside elegant cruelty learn to survive impact before they learn to protest it. So I kept my face arranged. I walked the remaining steps. I felt my father's hand shift against my forearm exactly once. The way men adjust grip when they think the object they are guiding has become slightly unstable but still publicly manageable. At the front, he placed my hand in Noah's. He kissed my cheek. For the audience, for the photographs, for the family archive that would otherwise have to explain a missing paternal gesture. And then he stepped back into the front pew beside my mother, wearing the expression of a man who had performed his role acceptably. Noah looked at me once. Only once. That was enough. He knew something had happened. Not what. Not yet. But he knew the air around me had changed. The minister began. The vows proceeded. My body did what bodies do in moments of high shock and high ritual. It completed the next required task. I said the words. I heard Noah say his. I felt the ring slide onto my finger. At some point, the church shifted from unbearable to impossibly still, the way certain rooms do when everyone inside believes they are participating in one story, while one person at the center has already been forced into another. When the minister pronounced us married, people stood, applauded. My mother cried in the first pew with enough beauty that 3 women behind her would later tell me how moving she looked. My father smiled, the smile I had spent my life watching him use at closings, funerals, and donor dinners. It is difficult to describe the disorientation of being congratulated while your nervous system is still replaying a sentence like shrapnel. At the receiving line, I kept waiting for my body to choose something for me. Trembling, collapse, numbness, rage. Instead, what came was a strange brightness. Hyperclarity. The flowers were too fragrant. The church air too cool. The fabric at my waist too tight. Every guest handshake landed as data. Every "you look stunning" felt almost anthropological. As if I were studying how many forms of celebration could comfortably coexist with total ignorance. My father hugged Noah's parents. My mother adjusted my train for photographs. Someone handed me champagne. My maid of honor, Talia, stood close enough to act cheerful while her eyes kept searching mine for the truth. In the car between the church and the hotel, Noah took my hand and asked the only correct question. What did he say? We were alone in the back seat. The partition up. Rain threatening, but not yet falling. My bouquet on the seat beside me like a decorative witness. I stared out the window and heard myself answer more calmly than I felt. He said he wished I'd never been born. Noah went completely still. Not theatrically. Not enraged in the masculine way. Some men perform anger to make another person's pain newly about themselves. Still. Then he said, Claire. Just my name. Nothing else. I shook my head once. Not because I was fine. Because I could feel the room of my life dividing right there. Before the sentence. After the sentence. And I knew with a certainty that felt less emotional than structural that the reception could not proceed as if I had merely changed outfits. Noah asked, Do you want to leave? That question matters. It was the first clean freedom anyone had handed me all day. No expectation. No management. No implied cost. Just a door. I thought about it. Leave. Disappear. Get on a plane tomorrow. Send out some careful explanation about family emergency and intimate boundaries. Become. Forever. The bride who vanished from her own reception because her father said the one thing no one could later call a misunderstanding. But then another thought arrived. A sharper one. If I leave, he keeps the room. He keeps the shape of the story. He keeps the old family privilege of injuring privately while remaining publicly untouched. I looked at Noah and said, No. He waited. I want to stay. Okay. I want to speak. That changed his face slightly. Not because he disapproved. Because he understood the scale. My mother had planned speeches. My father expected one of those warm, professionally grateful daughter toasts where the bride thanks her parents for support. Elegance. And showing me what love and commitment look like. Ali. Polished enough to be called tradition. Noah did not ask me whether I was sure. That was another gift. Instead, he asked, Do you want me to stop you if this becomes something you don't want afterward? I thought about that too. Then said, No, I need at least one thing today to belong entirely to my own voice. He nodded. And from that moment on, whatever happened next became mine. The reception ballroom was all old hotel glamour and inherited money trying very hard to appear effortless. Tall windows, Champagne silk draping. White florals. Soft amber lighting. Band tuning in the corner. The kind of room my mother had wanted because it made everyone look gently improved. My parents moved through it beautifully. That is what still strikes me. How practiced they were. My father at the bar with former colleagues and old clients. My mother greeting Noah's relatives with watery-eyed grace. Receiving compliments about the ceremony. About my dress. About the flowers. About me. Everything arranged. Everything coherent. Everything unbearably intact. At some point during cocktail hour, Talia pulled me into a side hallway near the service corridor and said, "Tell me the truth right now." I did. She stared at me for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "If you want to burn this room down, I'll hold your bouquet." I laughed. Actually laughed. The kind of startled laugh that arrives when another woman speaks the sentence your body has not yet admitted it needed. I said, "Not burn it down." "What then?" I looked back toward the ballroom doors. "Correct it." That is the difference. I think. Between revenge born from chaos and revenge born from clarity. I did not want screaming. I wanted the room brought accurately into contact with itself. The first dance happened. Dinner began. The speeches were scheduled after the salad, and before the band shifted the night from ceremony into sanctioned joy. My father had already made one small toast during cocktail hour, about the honor of seeing one's daughter enter marriage with such poise. Poise. That word nearly made me choke on my champagne. My mother cried again. People clapped. No one knew. That is what made it all so clean and so grotesque. While the servers cleared plates, I went to the restroom alone. Locked myself in a marble stall. Sat down without meaning to, because my knees had begun to shake at last. The room smelled like hand soap, expensive perfume, and the faint chemical cold of hotel air conditioning. That was when I finally cried. Not loudly. Not beautifully. Just a few hard, disbelieving tears that felt less like emotion than proof. My body had not abandoned me entirely in favor of performance. I heard 2 women come in laughing about the flowers. One said, "Her father seems so devoted." I remember pressing my hand over my mouth and thinking, not for the first time in my life. How often devotion is simply whatever cruelty has not yet been disclosed in the right room. When I came back out, my reflection looked changed in a way makeup could not repair. Not ruined. Resolved. My speech had been prepared days earlier. Printed on thick cardstock. 2 paragraphs of gratitude. 1 anecdote about Noah. A soft line about my parents teaching me steadiness. I took the cards from my clutch. Read them once. Then tore them in half over a linen-lined trash bin outside the ballroom. That felt almost ceremonial. Not because the cards mattered. Because I understood, in that small physical gesture, that the daughter who had survived by pre-writing harmless versions of herself was no longer the only one in the room. When the MC announced the bride's remarks, everyone turned kindly toward me. That is the cruelty of receptions. The room is already tilted toward celebration. So almost anything spoken from the microphone is granted a few opening seconds of goodwill before people understand the weather has changed. I stood, took the microphone, looked at Noah first. He was watching me with the calm, worried attention of a man willing to let love become witness when it needs to. Then I looked at the room. at my mother's pearls, at my father's folded hands, at the tables of clients, cousins, old family friends, Noah's parents, college friends, donor acquaintances, people who had spent years admiring the Holloways for their polish without ever asking what exactly the polish was preserving. I began with the expected notes. I thanked everyone for coming. I thanked Noah's parents for raising a man so steady. I thanked my friends for carrying me through the logistics and emotions of the day. The room relaxed. Good. That mattered. Because truth lands harder when it does not announce itself as a mood swing. Then I said, I had prepared different remarks tonight. That got a warm laugh. I smiled too. Something graceful, brief, predictable. The sort of speech brides are supposed to give when the room has worked hard to become beautiful. Still safe. Still manageable. Then I added, but I've spent much of my life understanding that beautiful rooms can hide very expensive truths. The room shifted. Only slightly. Enough. My mother's face changed first. Not panic. Alertness. The kind women like her get when they sense social fabric may soon require emergency stitching. I kept going. My husband knows this about me already, which is one reason I married him. He understands that I don't trust harmony just because it's well lit. Noah smiled once. Tiny. Steady. That helped. Then I said the sentence that locked the room. Tonight. Right before my father walked me down the aisle. He leaned toward me and whispered that he wished I had never been born. Silence. Not polite silence. Vacuum. The kind that makes glassware sound suddenly dangerous. No one moved. My mother's hand went to her throat. My father remained very still. For one absurd second. I thought perhaps he might stand and deny it immediately. He did not. That was his first real defeat. Because men like him survive on interruption, on tone control, on the swift correction of female narratives before they become communal property. But the microphone was in my hand. The room was already listening. And if he stood, he would only confirm that some part of him understood exactly what he had done. So I continued. I want to be very careful now. Because weddings make people sentimental, and families like mine survive on sentiment when truth would be less flattering. A sound moved through the room. Not words. Recognition. Fear. Human beings reorganizing their understanding in real time. I am not saying this tonight for drama. I am saying it because for 28 years, my family has benefited from the difference between what is true in private and what looks respectable in public. And today, on the day I was supposed to step into a new life, my father gave me one final private sentence and expected the old arrangement to keep protecting him. By then, some guests were looking at my parents, others at me. Noah had not moved. Neither had Talia. I could feel female attention in the room sharpening. Women know this atmosphere. Not the specifics. The architecture. The moment a daughter stops smoothing. I looked at my father then. Directly. The first time all evening. And said, "You have spent my entire life teaching me that as long as cruelty is composed, it can still count as discipline, that if I remained polished enough, useful enough, impressive enough, I might someday earn a version of fatherhood from you that didn't arrive attached to contempt. I am done auditioning for tenderness from a man who experiences my humanity as inconvenience. My mother whispered my name. Just that. Claire? I turned toward her. And you? I said. Not loudly. Have spent my life translating his violence into concern so elegantly that sometimes even I forgot there was a bruise beneath the wording. She started crying. Real crying now. Not reception tears. No careful angle. No upward smile. Just grief and exposure colliding in expensive makeup. Part of me felt sorry for her. That is the terrible thing about daughters. We can feel pity and fury in the same breath and still be expected to serve the room. But I did not step back. Not this time. I returned to the guests. I know this is uncomfortable. It should be, because the version of family many of us were raised to admire depends on daughters swallowing very large injuries in very beautiful clothes. That sentence landed hardest with the older women. I could see it. Aunt faces. Donor faces. Friends of my mother's. Women whose bodies knew something before their manners allowed them to show it. One of Noah's aunts put down her fork and folded both hands together like she was in church. I went on. I am not saying this because I want pity. I have had enough of pity offered only after performance. I'm saying it because today is my wedding day. And I refuse to begin my marriage by helping my parents keep a lie more comfortable than my own life. My father finally spoke. Claire, that's enough. There it was. Too late. Too thin. And most importantly, I heard now, not as paternal authority but as what it had always actually been. Control, terrified of witnesses. I looked at him and said, "That sentence is the reason I'm speaking." Noah's father exhaled audibly. Someone in the back dropped a fork. No one laughed. No one tried to rescue the mood. Because by then, the room had become something rarer than celebration. It had become honest. I softened my voice after that. Not because I was weakening. Because once truth is established, you no longer need full force. My husband did not ask me to stay silent. My friends did not ask me to stay silent. The only people who ever consistently asked that of me were the two who benefited most from it. Then I turned to Noah. And because this is also our wedding, and because love deserves more than surviving other people's damage, I want to say something truer than the speech I prepared. I set the microphone lower. Not to steady it. To steady myself. Noah, you are the first person who has ever made me feel that being understood was not something I had to earn by staying easy. You have never confused my composure with emptiness, my strength with endless capacity, or my grace with permission to wound me quietly. And whatever happened before this day, that is the life I am entering now, not one where silence is the price of belonging. One where truth and love are allowed in the same room. He stood at that. Not because the room required it. Because he did. He walked the few steps toward me and put one hand at my back. That nearly undid me more than my father's sentence had. Because gentleness in public, when it is not performative, can feel like witnessing the whole size of your old deprivation. I turned back one last time to the guests. I'm sorry if this ruined the shape of the evening for some of you, but I think a ruined shape is sometimes the first honest architecture. And if anyone here has ever been taught to call cruelty family just because it arrived from a well-dressed source, then please hear me clearly tonight. Your silence does not make them respectable. It only makes you lonely. That was the end. Not with a scream. Not with a thrown glass. Not with security escorting anyone out. with truth held cleanly enough that the room could no longer pretend confusion. I handed the microphone back to the MC, who looked like a man whose professional training had not included this form of moral emergency. Noah took my hand. Visot. No band played. No one moved for several long seconds. Then something extraordinary happened. Noah's mother stood first. Not abruptly. Deliberately. She lifted her glass and said, "To Claire." That was all. Just my name. Then Noah's father stood too. Then Talia. Then one of my college friends. Then, table by table, glasses rose. Not out of spectacle. Out of alignment. The room, having been told the truth, chose a side without requiring me to continue bleeding for clarity. I will never forget the look on my father's face. Not rage. That would have been easier. Disorientation. Because for the first time in his life, a room he had entered, expecting deference, had instead reorganized around a woman he had spent years training to contain herself. My mother could not stop crying. One of her friends put an arm around her shoulders, though even from across the room I could see that the gesture carried less solidarity than reckoning. People comfort women like my mother differently once they understand that much of the grief at hand may be self-authored. The evening did not end immediately. That is another thing worth saying. Truth does not always blow up a room. Sometimes it remakes the oxygen, and then the evening continues under stricter moral law. Dinner resumed in fragments. Conversations quieted. The band waited. Some guests left early. Others came to me carefully. Not with gossip hunger, but with the stunned tenderness people use when they understand they have just watched someone stop protecting a lie at great personal cost. An older woman from my mother's museum board took both my hands and said, very softly, "I'm sorry for every time I admired your family's grace without asking what it cost you." That line still lives in me, because it named the actual social crime, not just one father's sentence. The ecosystem that rewarded the family until the daughter finally invoiced the room in truth. My father left before dessert. Of course he did. No speech. No confrontation. No public apology. He simply disappeared with the speed of a man who had always expected the option of strategic withdrawal once a room stopped flattering him. My mother stayed. That surprised me. She sat through the cake cutting like a woman being forced to witness her own translation skills fail in public for the first time. When she approached me later, she looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Not physically. Structurally. She said, "How could you do this tonight?" There are sentences mothers ask that reveal they still think chronology changes morality. How could you do this tonight? Not how could he say that today? I looked at her and answered with a calm I had spent years building. How could he? She closed her eyes once, then whispered, "People will never forget this." I said, "Neither will I." That was the whole exchange. And in that moment I understood something I wish more daughters learned earlier. Parents who fear public memory more than private harm are telling you exactly where you rank in their emotional economy. Noah and I left before the final set. Not in flight. In completion. The hotel hallway outside the ballroom felt strangely quiet after the density of the room. The carpet muted our steps. My veil was half pinned, half falling. Somewhere far behind us, the band had finally started again. Life, offensively, had resumed. We got into the elevator alone. The doors closed. And only then did I begin to shake. Not dainty shaking. Not cinematic trembling. The kind that starts in the sternum and moves outward once the body realizes it has survived the thing and may now collect its debt. Noah held me while the elevator descended. No speeches. No fixing. Just one hand at the back of my neck, and the other around my waist while I cried into his jacket hard enough to ruin the boutonniere. At the suite, I took off the shoes first. Then the earrings. Then the veil. Every object removed felt like the end of some older contract. I stood barefoot in the middle of the hotel room while city lights moved across the far windows and said, half laughing through tears, I think I destroyed my parents. Noah looked at me from the edge of the bed and said, no, you ended their privacy. That sentence may have saved me from years of misplaced guilt. Because daughters are trained so thoroughly to measure the emotional fallout of truth that we often confuse exposure with violence. They are not the same thing. The next morning, the calls began. My father first. Of course. 3 voicemails in under an hour. Tone tight. Controlled. Furious. In the way men become furious, when they know anger itself now sounds like corroboration. He said I had humiliated the family. He said I had chosen cruelty. He said whatever private grievance I carried could have been handled with dignity. Handled with dignity. There it was again. The family code for remain injurable in a smaller room. I did not call back. My mother texted instead. Please talk to me before this becomes irreversible. Irreversible. As if the speech had been the irreparable event, and not the sentence at the chapel doors or the 30 years that prepared it. I replied only once. It became irreversible a long time ago. I just stopped hiding it yesterday. Then I put my phone face down and went to breakfast with my husband. That meal remains one of the strangest and cleanest of my life. Coffee. Butter. 2 bright fruit. Hotel eggs trying too hard. And underneath it all, the quiet, almost guilty relief of a woman who has finally told the truth in the one room everyone warned her never to disturb. The fallout spread exactly as you'd imagine, and also not at all as anyone predicted. Some relatives called me brave. Some called me unstable. A few called Noah to ask whether I had been under unusual stress. That made him angrier than anything else. The gendered insult always arrives, dressed as concern. My father spent a week calling the event an emotional episode. My mother used the phrase catastrophic wedding choice to 2 separate women who then, thankfully, repeated it to people more honest than she expected. Because here's the thing about rooms after the truth. People begin comparing notes. An old law partner's wife remembered how tense I always looked around my father. A cousin remembered hearing him tell me at 12 that I was too theatrical to be impressive. One of my mother's closest friends admitted privately that she had always suspected Judith was more invested in appearance than attachment. This is how family myths actually die. Not in one explosion. In 100 smaller permissions. One person says, I saw something. Another says, so did I. And suddenly the daughter is no longer alone inside the archive. My father tried once to meet in person. At his club? Naturally. Neutral territory in his mind. Still flattering to him. I declined and offered a therapist's office instead. He refused. That told me everything. Men who truly want repair do not insist it happen in rooms where the furniture already agrees with them. Months passed. Then more. My mother sent birthday flowers and a note that said only, "Thinking of you." No apology, no reference. Just the old habit of substituting gesture for language. I thanked her by text. Nothing more. My father disappeared into the kind of social silence men call dignity, when they are waiting to see whether their own community will restore them if they stand still long enough. Some did, some didn't. The more interesting shift happened in me. For the first time in my life, I stopped preparing imaginary closing arguments before seeing my parents. You know the ones. If he says this, I'll say that. If she cries, I'll soften here. If the room gets tense, I'll make it more manageable. That internal courtroom finally adjourned. Not because I healed neatly, because I no longer needed the verdict. My marriage started in unusually honest terrain. There was no lingering illusion that Noah had married a woman untouched by family weather. There was also no longer any confusion about whether I would reorganize myself forever to protect old people from the consequences of their own language. That clarity made love easier. Harder too. Sometimes. But real. A year later, Noah and I hosted a smaller anniversary dinner in Baltimore. Just friends. A few family members from his side. Warm lights. Good wine. No speeches required. At one point, one of his aunts asked whether we would be seeing my parents for Christmas. I said, maybe my mother. Then left it there. Noah squeezed my knee under the table. Tiny gesture. Private allegiance. The sort of thing I once thought marriage was mostly about. I know better now. Marriage is not a permanent audience for your pain. It is a place where the truth does not have to be housebroken before entering. That is what I had stepped into that night. Even if the doorway ran through fire. 2 years after the wedding, my mother asked to see me alone. Not at the house. Not at a restaurant she could perform through. At a church garden near the chapel where I married Noah. That location choice told me something had shifted. We sat on a bench beneath crepe myrtles, while late light moved over the brick paths. She looked older. Softer in the face. More breakable than I had ever allowed myself to imagine. For a while, she said nothing. Then she asked, "Do you know what I think about most?" I waited. The smile on his face when he said it. That line startled me so much I had to look at her fully. Because yes, that had always been part of the wound. Not only the sentence, the composure, the intactness of him. She twisted her gloves in her lap and said, "I have spent my entire life telling myself that civility was a kind of goodness. That if a man was controlled, he was not dangerous. That if I could keep the house beautiful enough, the emotional truth inside it would somehow become less ugly." Then she looked at me. I was wrong. It was not enough. Let me say that clearly. One sentence from a mother does not rebalance a childhood. But truth spoken plainly by the right person at the right time can stop the bleeding from being called imagination. I asked her why she stayed with him. She answered with the kind of honesty women usually reach only after the social return on deception has dropped low enough. Because I thought surviving him elegantly was a form of success. I almost laughed. Not cruelly. Just from the grim recognition of inheritance. How many women had been taught that exact religion? She went on. And because as long as he was hardest on you, I could go on pretending I wasn't his victim too. There it was. The dirtiest family truth. Children often carry the emotional impact that preserves the marriage. Not because the parents plan it openly, because systems route pressure somewhere, and daughters, who can absorb, become useful. I said, "I won't do that anymore." She nodded. "I know." We did not reconcile theatrically. No embrace. No music. No forgiveness monologue. Just a bench, a garden, and two women old enough to finally speak without needing the lie to survive them. My father never apologized in any full and satisfying way. He sent one letter, typed, unsigned except for his name. 3 pages of tone-controlled regret. Selective memory. Contextualization. And one sentence that came as close as he was ever likely to get. What I said that day was inexcusable. No why. No deep admission. No direct ownership of the years. Just that. I read it once, placed it in a drawer, and let that be the exact size of him. That may be the final lesson of parents like mine. Not every wound closes because the person who caused it finally understands its dimensions. Some close because you stop requiring the person to become emotionally literate in order for your own life to proceed. The reception speech did change everything. Not because it fixed the past, because it ended the private-public split that had protected my parents for decades. After that night, no one in our circle could discuss the Holloways as uncomplicatedly gracious people without also hearing, somewhere under the china and lilies and polished shoes, the sound of a daughter's voice refusing to keep the room comfortable. And me? I changed too. I became easier in some ways, sharper in others, less willing to call management love, less willing to confuse endurance with virtue, much less impressed by elegant families. When our daughter was born 3 years later, I held her in the hospital while morning light climbed the blinds and thought one very clear thought. No child of mine will ever have to earn gentleness by being convenient. That was my true vow. Not the one in the chapel, the one afterward. The one built from rubble and choice. If this story found something real in you, stay with the channel. Some fathers only love the version of a daughter that never interrupts the picture they plan to hang. And sometimes the bravest thing a woman does is stop smiling inside the frame and let the whole room hear what the picture cost.